Hopefully there are people who want to join on board. We had like 280 people registered for it.
Oh, wow. That's great.
How does that translate? We'll find out. Hi, everybody. As everybody's signing in, welcome. It's Mike Connell again. We're just going to let people sign in, give a few minutes for everybody to get on board, and then we will start our webinar this week. So as you're signing on board, I would ask everybody, on their Zoom windows on the little chat button, if they maybe can just put down what country they're from, and also maybe if there's a question you may have about technology in your business. Once we get started with Adam, that will be the focus for the next 50 minutes. We'll be talking about technology and vet practices. And I'd also ask if you have some questions. There's the Q&A button on the bottom too. You can put maybe some of your specific questions there, but love to hear what right now, where you're from and some of your bigger challenges that you have with technology. And that helps us to understand what people want, and we can make sure that we have a great conversation with everybody. So Adam, why don't we start? So I'm really happy to introduce Adam Little, Dr. Adam Little. Adam is based in Vancouver, Canada, the other side of the country from where I'm at right now. Known Adam for several years. He participated in a couple of the Oculus summits when we were allowed to have in-person meetings a number of years ago. And Adam spoke to us on technology at one conference in Austin, and at another time when we had a great conference in Amsterdam. And Adam made a huge hit on the people that attended. And I said, now that we have created this COVID resiliency guide through Oculus, the one person I wanted to get involved with this is Adam, because technology is so much of where our profession is going. So Adam, welcome. Why don't you tell everybody a little bit about yourself and how your background and how you ended up in technology.
Yeah. Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to folks, depending on where they're calling in for. Thanks, Mike, for inviting me to participate here. So my name is Dr. Adam Little. I'm a veterinarian and call Vancouver, British Columbia home. Sometimes it's hard to believe, but I did initially intend to be a practicing veterinarian. And, my experiences kind of put me on a slightly different path, but I think it's important to acknowledge up front that I didn't kind of go into vet school not expecting to kind of follow the traditional path. I'm a graduate of the Ontario Veterinary College, and throughout my time in vet school and beyond, I became really interested in kind of systems of healthcare. And from my perspective, if my motivation and real goal was to help as many pets as possible, which for me was a real driving influence in my decisions and kind of a North Star that I wanted to pursue, the best way to be able to do that was to enable and create models of care that could empower more veterinarians to more effectively and efficiently support their patients and clients. And I became quite fascinated in the ways in which technology could be used to help augment and extend the roles of the veterinary team. I'm the co-founder of GoFetch Health, which I'm sure we'll get into at some point, but my career has spanned everything from designing and developing decision support tools for vets using artificial intelligence, working with some early stage wearable device and sensor companies that were looking at new ways in which they could gather information from patients, both inside and outside of the clinic setting, working with groups on the regulations around telemedicine, to helping large organizations cope and deal with change. And I think, one of the interesting things about what's happening now is that a lot of the technologies and trends and kind of what we're witnessing is at this moment in time is actually in a lot of ways the product of the last decade of work that has been going on by small teams and entrepreneurs and companies that have really tried to in some ways start to build a different sort of future for veterinary clinics. And when you couple that with the pressures and constraints of what the situation has created, it really has acted as a catalyst to maybe accelerate those solutions into the market. And so it's been really fascinating to see how clinics have been adapting, and in many ways how they have, being on the front lines, had to shift the ways in which they serve their clients and patients. And I think one of the things that we'll get into, which will be an important consideration, is, how do you shift from this mindset of just reacting to the constraints that are being placed on your practice to maybe looking more holistically about what is possible for your clinic moving forward, and how can these be less of kind of short-term reactive additions or tasks, but looking towards a more sustainable model of care, in part enabled by some of the technologies that are now available.
Yeah, no, I think what you would say is spot on, is that what this whole pandemic is doing is sort of accelerating changes that were going to happen anyhow. And so the question I have for you is, this is actually, the timing is probably great for your business, and not that you want to have this kind of misfortune benefit you, but I mean, whenever we have these pandemics, there are those who see the opportunities and take advantage of them. So before we get to the COVID-19 and where we are now, is what made you go into GoFetch? It's a telemedicine portal. Plus, so why don't we tell everybody a bit more about your product? But I'm more curious about why you focused on telemedicine. I mean, you're an entrepreneurial person, you've got a lot of ideas, and boy, I'm sure there was a lot of choices for you of where you wanted to spend your time. Why telemedicine?
Yeah, no, great question. So for context, I'm the co-founder of GoFetch Health. We're a Canadian-based company that operates a membership program to help pet owners afford and access care. And as a business, we are trying to do kind of two things in parallel. The first is enable an experience for pet parents that allows them to have kind of that modern digital experience with the practice, really focused on these two pillars of helping make care more affordable and providing incentives and rewards that enable them to feel like the clinic is actually helping them save money, and incentivizing them to do what's best for their pet. And then the second pillar being able to access support between visits. But one of the unique things about and for context, this is a company that we actually started back in 2015, the earliest iterations of it, before I jumped full-time in the fall of 2017, with the membership model actually being launched last spring. So this is kind of a problem that we have been working on, or I've been working on at least throughout my entire career. But at the same time, as much as we focus on the experience that we want to provide to pet owners, we've been really thoughtful and really unique in how we think about the relationship with practices. Most technology companies have a software solution that they sell to practices, and they say, here's my thing to manage your bookings or reminders or telemedicine. I'm going to sell you this software. You're going to pay me some money. And then that's the relationship. Whether or not the software actually does what you want it to, whether it's successful, whether it achieves your goals, is almost a secondary priority. And the incentives aren't really necessarily aligned from a business perspective. So what ends up happening is clinics have an overwhelming amount of software solutions that are available. None of them usually work as well as they would like. And then they're stuck with monthly bills or software commitments or other kind of restrictions, which in some ways constrain what they can do, but oftentimes they're just paying for things that they're not really maximizing and utilizing. And so our model works a little bit differently, where we don't charge practices. There's no software fees, there's no monthly fees, there's no setup fees. And instead we make our money off these membership fees that we charge the pet owner for. And the goal is to basically help augment the veterinary team and be that kind of almost like virtual care member that, never sleeps, gets the right information that's available, handles those online conversations with your clients, and then in doing so creates a radically better experience for the pet owners, but can kind of plug in and layer on top of almost any veterinary clinic, regardless of its size, technical sophistication, or budget. A big part of that is having a lot of empathy for the types of problems that the practice is looking to solve, and trying to figure out where we as a company can position ourselves to add value. And we, as a membership, always had this teletriage support that was available. So members could always chat or phone and speak to a veterinarian or veterinary nurse whenever they had quick questions or advice. But around the middle of February, late February, we started to see that due to COVID, things were likely to look very different. And even in our kind of estimations of things ended up being less severe, there was likely going to be a need for us to expand the ways that we could support practices. In addition to that, practices were coming to us and saying, our existing clinic partners, and saying, hey, it's great that my clients can have access to these benefits. They have the teletriage, they can earn some rewards, that's fantastic. But I, as a veterinarian, now really want to provide telemedicine to my clients, which up until that point, we hadn't had practices that were really like banging down our doors saying that they wanted to do that, because that is a workflow that has traditionally been incompatible with the ways that practices usually operate. And so what we ended up doing was prioritizing the rollout of a set of features that allowed our clinic partners to be able to offer virtual video consults to their clients, align the business model in a way where practices could stand that up very quickly, and there wasn't any additional costs associated with that. Instead, we took kind of a small transaction fee associated with each of those consults, and it became for us the most kind of requested kind of feature that our practices had, and became a way for us to be able to expand relationships with new practices. So we've now been running that for, just over two months. And really the last month is when we got up and running, and it's been really eye-opening to see the different ways in which practices are now using those capabilities, some of the best practices that are emerging, and on the flip side, what are the barriers that are stopping other practices from being as successful? Many of which aren't necessarily technical barriers, but rather workflow, implementation, and team constraints that we are kind of emerging with a set of like recommendations around. So happy to talk more about that. But yeah, GoFetch Health is a membership program that's really focused on building that experience in a way where practices, we like to say, don't have to do anything and don't have to pay anything. Yeah, really excited to see how we've been able to help and kind of create for us a reason to be helpful given what's happening.
So it's interesting because we spent the last 2 webinars on marketing, and what you talk about is identifying what your customers value. They came to you, you really seize the opportunity. And I think that's a perfect segue into talking about telemedicine, because you and I both know some practices that are just absolutely flourishing since they've adopted telemedicine. So maybe you can just walk through how, in your mind, or when you've talked to your clients, how a good telemedicine appointment goes.
Yeah, for sure. There's kind of a few key things that have emerged for us as differentiators between the practices that are doing, let's say, a fantastic job. And by that, let's say upwards of 10 consults a day, $1,000 in just telemedicine revenue, just telemedicine consult revenue. And those that, are only doing a few bookings a day. So when I kind of think about at least our company, but at a high level, the framework that practices could think of for like scheduled telemedicine consults, we can get into like other different forms. There's kind of 3 components. You need some sort of scheduling, you need some way to collect payment, and then some way to actually provide the care itself. From a scheduling perspective, one of the best practices that we've seen is the idea to be able to create kind of blocks of time or separation between the veterinarians that are responsible for providing that curbside care and the veterinarians that are going to be providing the dedicated telemedicine consults. And there's a couple obvious reasons for that, but a couple non-obvious reasons for that. The first is, if you have a veterinarian that is responsible for both telemedicine calls and the drop-offs, those drop-offs are always going to take top priority. And so you end up creating a situation where there's a lot of distraction and defocusing, and in light of what's coming in the door, those patients are going to take priority, and the model sort of collapses onto itself. The other thing is that one of the advantages of having dedicated doctor hours is that you can actually you can get into the flow of those appointments as opposed to hopping between different activities, which again can be really distracting and make you less efficient. And then the third is it allows you to use resources outside of the practice. So the clinics that we've seen from a scheduling perspective are basically saying, look, here's a doctor that's available for telemedicine. We're going to book those appointments in, and we're going to allow them to really focus on providing that digital care without necessarily being responsible for what happens when people come in. So that's one key point. The second, which relates to the schedule, is that the front desk needs to act as an advocate for the service. So the clinics, one of the questions that we often get asked is, what cases should we practice telemedicine on? And the most successful practices that we've seen actually kind of invert the question, where they instead look at it from the perspective of everything's a telemedicine case, unless there is a set of reasons why this needs to be an urgent care. And that's not to say that those patients might not necessarily have to come back into the practice. But what we've seen is that the clinics that are not doing or not utilizing telemedicine or some sort of triage or system for those curbside appointments are ending up with longer appointment times, more communication with the clients when they're waiting at their cars, and an inability to kind of get the pet and just execute on the treatment plan. And so we see that as opposed to there being kind of two parallel paths, telemedicine is kind of the default first step. And if your pet does need to come in, they know what they're coming in for. You can educate the clients upfront as to what the process is going to be, drive compliance and adherence to your plan, manage the payment so that when the pet does get dropped off, it's executing against that plan, which is a very different workflow than most of the curbside experience that clinics are currently adopting. So those are kind of two big key ones that we've seen emerge. Maybe one last one on the pricing side. Most of the clinics that we've seen be successful have a pricing structure where they're charging at or near their existing consult fee. So they're not charging $20 or $30 to hop on a 30-minute call. They're charging somewhere between $75 or $100. I think our average consult fee right now on our platform is about $90. However, the caveat is if you need to come in as a result of this consult, they don't charge them another exam fee. And that's almost important for both, I think, your staff and your clients to reinforce the value of this process. Because if you're treating it like a lesser option, your clients are going to interpret it as a lesser option. Your staff aren't going to want to recommend it. They're not going to be confident when they explain it on the phone. And so this allows you to create a model where you're basically reinforcing the value of your time, demonstrating to your clients that this is going to be a valuable interaction and that you can actually do quite a bit for their pet, and then giving them the peace of mind if they do need to be brought in, that they're not going to get double charged or somehow there's going to be a fee that's snuck in there. Right. So those are kind of maybe three keys differences that we've seen in best practices between the practices that are struggling and those that are being much more successful.
Right. And I've got a couple of comments on that, but just before I go into them, just if anybody has any questions for Adam or for myself, just check in on the Q&A button and just type into the question and we'll make sure that we get to it. One of the things I know in talking to some of the veterinarians I know who are doing really well with it is a couple of things that they have commented, and that is it's better to start off with a more senior vet. Particularly just because it's so nuanced, it's a new delivery of care. And if you're a fresh vet, maybe 1 or 2 years out of vet school, you're still getting your legs underneath you as a practitioner and then having to deal with seeing somebody on video. The other is one person, and a couple of people I've talked to have said that up to 30% of their telemedicine visits are new clients, people that have heard about them or have moved away out of their territory and said, well, hey, I always loved you as a vet. I don't live near you, but I still want you to look at my animals. So yeah. I know a couple of them who I've talked to are, my age, they're in their mid or late 50s, and they're saying like, I never thought I'd be in telemedicine at all. And now they're like, oh my God, I am the biggest convert. Like this has changed our practice like you wouldn't believe. And so what they're either using is a platform like yourself, or they're just using a Zoom call. I think a lot of them like using a platform like yourself because then they don't have to talk about payments. That's been done with in advance. But really, it's so important to have the receptionist, the team really engage with it. And I think most people were very wary at first, but now that they see that it's working and that clients are demanding it and are really liking it, that it's a huge thing. So we're talking about telemedicine. The other thing I want to talk to you too is about e-commerce, having an online store. And I know, and depending on where you live in the world, like just look right now, we have people on this call from Europe, North, and all across North America. So everybody's going to have their own availability to an e-commerce store. So perhaps you could talk just broadly about what you think and the value that e-commerce brings to a vet practice in these days.
Yeah, for sure. Maybe just one quick comment on your feedback there. It is really fascinating, and in terms of how a lot of the anxieties and general maybe angst of what could go wrong starts to dissipate when you actually have true consults, and it goes. I think what you find is that, at least from the veterinarians, it sounds like you've spoken to as well, you go from this idea of why why would this be valuable? Why would clients like it? What could I provide? This is, silly or stupid or unnecessary, to wait a second, like I feel good about helping people and there's a lot that I thought I could do. And even if it's not, the same as doing surgery on their pet, I think people underappreciate the value of veterinarians' time and advice. And so to be able to have those connections with clients, I think is a really important first step, because the confidence compounds in your entire organization as you start to have positive interactions. And you realize that the interactions that go sideways aren't nearly as problematic or maybe difficult to handle as you might have anticipated.
In
In
fact,
terms of
some of them
the,
have said that
yeah,
for certain appointments is actually better because you're seeing the animal in their environment. They're
yeah,
not stressed at the vet. They're just having come out of a car ride. They're not distracted. So they said for behavioral issues, lameness issues, nothing beats it. And
yeah.
so that's like they're almost like, I don't want to go back to doing in-clinic appointments because this is a far better way diagnostically.
Yeah, and I think this is where the clinics, again, that are being most successful, and this actually does relate to e-commerce, are recognizing that like it doesn't have to be a binary choice. You can create an experience where these pieces of the care continuum are very much connected and build upon each other in a way that you're not necessarily having to make these existential choices as to like whether or not this is the way to do things of the future. This is like, I think that it's more of a collaborative and integrated approach, and that does relate to e-commerce. One of the things that I think is really important on the e-commerce side is that you can imagine as a consumer yourself, like if you went to Amazon and it required you hopping between 3 different pages, calling somebody, waiting 48 hours for a response, like Amazon wouldn't function as a business. Like those steps in the process, whether or not you're creating steps or eliminating them, the amount of friction between those steps will be correlated to the likelihood that somebody will follow through with that purchase. And what's happened is that because of all the other established ways that we buy things, there's a certain threshold that you need to be able to clear. Otherwise, it will feel like a broken experience. And so there's been the e-commerce piece is really interesting because you can kind of insert that conversation in a whole bunch of areas of care, right? Coming out of those telemedicine consults, giving people links to be able to make those product purchases, et cetera. But I think that there's a real value in the practice being able to kind of eliminate the friction whenever possible and guide people and reinforce this as an option for your clients. So it's not enough to just throw it on your website and then hope it's successful. When people are calling in to order products, you need to reinforce this as an option. We've seen practices provide additional incentives to drive people towards using those e-commerce tools. And this idea of being proactive to help clients know that, hey, your pet or your pets need these medications, or it's that time of year again, and you should be looking at prevention so that you're not expecting people to remember. 2 is making it actionable. Here is where you need to go to make that purchase. And then eliminating the friction as much as possible. So either setting it up in a way where when they do pick up medications, they don't have to wait in line. They don't have to call the front desk. They can just, text you and then get those medications, or ideally, ship them to home. We've seen practices that have done a lot with even the pickup or delivery experience to really eliminate any more friction associated with those purchases. But I think it's, again, this idea of the workflow and where this fits in, because if your staff isn't communicating it or sees it as a lesser option or isn't reinforcing its use, people are going to naturally just default to what they have done before. And so you need to look at it from a perspective of what is the role of our staff in driving compliance around this service, and how do we want to either incentivize or nudge clients to be able to participate in that. So those are a few things on the e-commerce side that I think are just worth being aware of. And there's a lot of creativity that practices can use in order to create a better experience around that for their clients.
So right now we're talking a lot about technology, but some of the last few things you've been talking about is it really becomes the people within the organization that drives the technology. And if people think that, well, because I have this new, really robust e-commerce platform or telemedicine platform, that everything will work well for me. But maybe you want to spend a few comments or some few moments commenting on some of the successes that you have seen in practices, or those that struggle that don't factor in the people within the business, the training, the leadership that drives these changes.
Yeah, and I think this is something that we've seen, like there's practices that we work with, and we kind of know that it's going to be successful before we start because they have a really well-established way in which they communicate and train people, and they've been able to successfully implement other things before. If your practice has always struggled with any change, this is probably a tough time for you, because the muscle memory and the support and the ability to quickly and effectively implement a new tool, that culture isn't in place yet. And so you're probably gonna have to do a little bit more heavy lifting. I think one of the first things that's important to understand is this like alignment of incentives. Because let me share an example. There's lots of practices today that, despite the fact that they're seeing less clients and making less revenue, they're actually more exhausted than ever before, because all their appointment times are now double. They're having to do a lot more communication before and after those appointments. People are stressed. They can't practice in their normal way, and they're short-staffed with reduced hours.
A lot of that too.
That's a very tough environment to practice in. So if you're going to that team, who at this point is probably looking for less things to do and saying, I have a new way that we can see more clients, their reaction isn't going to be a positive one, right? In fact, they're actively disincentivized from doing that. And so when you implement these tools and you're like, well, why haven't we booked a single telemedicine call? They're just going to keep telling you that they're busy. But more fundamentally, like there's very little reason why they would be willing to incentivize or encouraged to follow those practices. And so I think it's important to not look at this from like a broad brush perspective, and instead focus on very specific workflows and problems that you can alleviate. Because right now it kind of feels like everything's on fire. And so you're like, where do we even start, right? If everybody's burnt out by this entire process, how can we even begin to make an impact? And so one of the most important things to do is start to really detail out and understand these flows and where are the most significant pain points. So you might find why people are exhausted is really tied to the fact that they're having to do a lot of pre-work with these clients. They're making far more phone calls than ever before. And the phone calls are really about these 3 or 4 main categories of things. Well, that at least gives you a problem that you can attack with a specific solution. So I think one of the biggest issues right now from a staff training perspective is that the problem definition is very general. People are just tired and exhausted. The solutions in their implementation are very general. We're just going to use telemedicine. And there isn't really the socket and plug ability to say, okay, this is a problem that you're dealing with, and this is how this approach is really going to solve it. And I think that's where there's a missed opportunity. So that's kind of one piece, because if you don't have buy-in around that, it doesn't really matter what the tool is. The second part is that really understanding who the champions are of the practice is like basically mission critical. For a lot of things like telemedicine, you don't need everybody to be on board initially, and that might actually slow things down. There's always going to be a doctor or a technician or somebody who doesn't want to be involved. And if they're not willing to participate, you're probably going to waste a lot of time and energy trying to convince them to do something that they're just not in the right headspace or mindset to do that. So instead, demonstrating earlier wins, more success, and moving faster with a smaller team and building up that confidence and showing those results to your team will start to allow you to expand the program. So for example, you might be sitting here being like, we'd love to do telemedicine because it speeds up our drop-off appointments, but our team thinks it's going to make them twice as long. Well, as opposed to just ending it there, why don't you take 10 telemedicine appointments, figure out how many of them are actually resulting in drop-offs, look at the time, effort, and experience of those drop-off appointments, and then beginning to bring some data to that experience, as opposed to just being stuck in this deadlock kind of situation where neither group is willing to move an inch. So I think those are a couple things. This idea of being very specific on what problems you want to solve when you have buy-in from your team on solving those issues, and being able to demonstrate and learn quicker and show success earlier will likely create a culture where you're able to do more in a much more effective way.
And even if you're a practice that, everything has been steady the last few years, you didn't really have to worry about change. I mean, a lot of practices were in a good position. They did well. They've had very loyal clients. The economy is good. And regardless of how you feel about change, I mean, all your staff and your clients are going to understand if you're saying, we got to do something different now,
Yeah.
And so this is the impetus to make major changes. And, if you get that small group of believers within your practice, say, all right, we're going to try it out. And, and if we can get a smaller group that we can manage better, the odds of success are much higher than just saying, all right, everybody, we're all in this together and let's hope it works.
Yeah, I think the other thing too, a really important point that you just mentioned, which is that there's a degree of understanding and like room for lack of a better word, failure right now across every business. Like the restaurants that you go to, the cafes that you go, they're all trying new things. They say on their websites it's not going to be perfect, but you're willing to support those businesses because for a lot of people, they want to find unique ways to help their community. We have a local brewery. We have a bunch of local breweries in Vancouver. I can buy their beer from the BC liquor store, but I'm going out of my way to go support their businesses, get the drop-off service or whatever, pay the extra delivery charge because they're businesses that I support and they've been good to me. And leveraging that goodwill right now as the fuel to allow your practice to do new things is really important. Because on the flip side, I would say that when you're going to your clients and saying, look, we want to make this safer for you and more convenient for you. We don't want you to have to come in unless you have to. We want to make sure that your pet and you can be as comfortable as possible and see you in the convenience of your home. And we want to make sure that you have dedicated time with the doctor that you know and trust to be able to help your pet and not feel that you're isolated to the point that you can't get that care. Well, that's a really positive message to your clients. That shows that you actually care about their pets as opposed to maybe putting them in a situation where they're less comfortable, there's more friction, which I'm seeing happening where, you have a full parking lot. There's certainly people that are understanding, but there's a lot of people that maybe that goodwill is sometimes eroded because they're just waiting in the parking lot for an hour. They're not getting a lot of information. They recognize that you're doing the best that you can, but not everybody is always the most reasonable folks. And those interactions really spill over to the burnout I think that we're seeing, where if you have one or two bad drop-off appointments in a day, it can really suck the life out of your team.
I know we wanted to talk about the maximizing the value of the drop-off experience, but before we leave telemedicine, we have a question here, and I'll read it out just so everybody can hear it. And this person says their biggest struggle with telemedicine is how much their doctors value diagnostics, ear swabs for ear infections, blood work, radiographs, etc., which obviously require the patient to be on site. And so what type of appointments are you finding that are most successful for telemedicine?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Maybe I can illustrate this with an example. So I think it's important to approach the team in a way where you're saying, we're not precluded from doing those things. We're not trying to diminish their importance. We're not trying to eliminate them from providing those care. From care, we have some clinics, for example, right now, they're doing kind of like decoupled wellness appointments. And so they're going into those telemedicine appointments saying like, look, we know your pet's going to need to come in. We can't do rabies vaccines over the phone, but this is the way that the appointment's going to be structured. We're going to have this consult. We're going to walk through the plan. We're going to address your concerns. When your pet does need to drop off, we can book them in for, whether it's a tech appointment or less time with the doctor. You know what you're coming in for. We can, again, provide those diagnostics. And so it's not trying to argue with your medical team or your doctors to say, like, look, we're just not going to do those things anymore. But if and when those things are required, that can look radically different than it does right now. We can have the client knowing what they're showing up for. We can prepare accordingly. We can handle the payment ahead of time. We can be in a position to provide the same level of care that you would like to provide, but in a more efficient package. And the alternative is that, in some of these cases where you thought those diagnostics might be required, they might not be. So I think it's important because I think from the veterinarians that kind of have that emotional reaction, where perhaps they're just saying there's not a lot that we can do. There's almost nothing that you can do to convince them that that's not the case unless they start doing the exams themselves, right? It's only through their own experience that they can get a feel of what's required and what's not. But I think, again, going in to that process with an understanding that, look, we're not saying that you have to fit your care recommendations into this box. You can still do anything or recommend anything that you think is required. But as a result, we think it will be a better experience for the client and allow our team to work more efficiently.
Yeah,
We've had some clinics that have reported even higher levels of revenue per patient visit because the compliance on diagnostics is going up as a result of telemedicine, not going down, because now people are understanding what's required and they're, committing to the plan, as opposed to being told that in the exam room that they're going to have to, pay $300 for diagnostics that they weren't prepared for.
Well, I mean, it gives you that time to think about it too.
Yeah.
And I know some of the doctors that I've spoken to, it's fact, what they've realized is that the vets who are on site actually welcome these appointments for the diagnostics because they already have a history, they have a signalment, they know everything. And so they're just filling in the missing pieces of the diagnostic puzzle, and they feel part of the team. So I mean, this is a great segue and talk about.
It's a great question, though.
Pardon me?
Oh, sorry, that's a great question. It's a great question.
Yeah, but sort of the drop-off experience, because as we've said in all practices, that there is a certain level of drop-off that we have to do, and it's exhausting a lot of people. We're not as efficient with it. I know of myself, I've had my own cat, we've had to bring it to the vet and drop it off, and sometimes it works well and sometimes it's a pain that you got to come back later on in the day. So what are your recommendations to maximizing the value of the curbside type of business that we have to do now?
Yeah, so I think this is something that is certainly becoming a major bottleneck for practices. And I think one of the things that's a little bit less and more anxiety inducing is that even as restrictions are lifted and social distancing rules might be relaxed, like people going into the practices might still take a while, right? And so it's shifted from being kind of this like temporary restriction to maybe like might be the flow that we have to support for a while. Mm-hmm. So I think the first thing is like the preparation before the appointment. And there's some clinics that are doing this very well. All the information is on their website, explained every single phone call, every appointment that's booked, the email confirmation has all that. Your autoresponders, when people do email you with questions, have information about your process. I think this has made a lot more challenging if a client is showing up with their pet and doesn't really understand the new flow, and then you have to accommodate that, as opposed to they are very clear on what the process is going to be when they arrive at your practice. And it's not enough to just expect that you're going to tell them on the phone and they're going to just realize that, right? The same way that we need repetition and reinforcement of basically anything, you need to expect and provide that support to your clients as well. So for example, things like setting up numbers that people can text, where when they text saying that they're here, it reinforces again, just a reminder, this is going to be the process, etc. So I think that preparation before those drop-offs and reinforcing your flow, whatever it might be, across both in message and signage at your practice, any digital communications with the client, any communications on the phone, and really reinforcing that flow is mission critical. So that's kind of the first thing that's important. And of particular importance, obviously, for those telemedicine appointments as well. We have some practices that, for example, their technicians jump in at the last 5 minutes of that telemedicine consult, if required, to act as that kind of handoff point for the client so that they know what's expected. So that's kind of one piece. The second is really understanding, and I think the payment piece is a bit of a bottleneck here as well. Like, how are you going to go about getting compliance and executing on that plan? If, for example, your client, one situation, the client has no idea their pet's been vomiting, they're going to drop them off. You don't have kind of buy-in of that treatment plan. You don't necessarily have payment information. It might be a very reactive exam that could probably stretch out quite a while, especially if their person isn't picking up their phone or they're chatting to somebody else. And so what are the ways in which you're going to quickly and easily get information from clients that doesn't overburden your staff? So we see practices that set up like dedicated texting numbers for their staff, and that's how they communicate with the clients, which is really interesting. It allows you to send photos and videos. We have some practices that are actually doing kind of reverse telemedicine, where they stick, when they're doing the exam with the patient, they're zooming out to the person in the waiting room or to the parking lot. But any way that you can reduce the amount of touch points that you're going to have with a client in order to get the information and buy-in that you need to execute that plan is really critical. Because if you're playing phone tag with them while they're in the parking lot, that's going to be obviously really distracting to your team. This is where, photos, videos, any information is really critical to be able to help the person understand what you're seeing. Things like the treatment and estimates, I think, are really useful as well, because that way you can give people information ahead of time, which you might even want to do. I'm sure practices are doing this, but when a client books a drop-off appointment based on its primary signal, you could give them an estimate to say, these are some of the services that we might be considering, just to help them understand what might be expected. So that piece is important. So like the preparing for those drop-off consults, what it actually looks like for the client that's coming in. And then the third piece is kind of the follow-up care. And so what processes do you have in place? The same way that you would before, are you calling back every client? Are there other ways that you can do follow-up? For do surveys and follow up with clients directly for the telemedicine consults that we do, but basically who's in charge of that process. And I think what's really critical is understanding throughout the pre, in, and post, where are the handoff points with your staff? What are the responsibilities that they're in charge of? And how can you be more efficient internally to understand when those handoffs are required? So we have a lot of practices now that are using things like Slack in order to basically better track and funnel the entire experience. So when a client does arrive, the team knows, they know what's expected, et cetera. And I think you're going to begin to see clinics that are basically operating using some of these digital communication tools between their team members in order to better manage and execute on that drop-off flow.
Yeah, I could, one of the things as I've been talking to people about telemedicine and e-commerce is I almost think that our roles of our support staff are going to shift a little bit in terms of how we take care of customers. Two examples is, when, let's say you have a telemedicine consult at 10, well, maybe the first 3 minutes is the receptionist or the concierge or the hostess for this call to say, all right, let's just make sure your systems work. This is how it's going to work. Just, we're going to do a mic and a video check. And, oh, do you have your cat? Or you caught your dog? Whatever. The other is, I also think as we're recording these appointments, it really gives us an opportunity to really increase the value of our medical records. And so, let's say you're doing a lameness or a behavioral, you could be editing out videos and having it part of the record of saying, see, this is where I saw the lameness, or this is where I saw the neurological deficit. And, then it's good for progress exams, but it really shows people like, oh, this is what I was talking about. Oh, the video is slowed down. You can see how the stride has changed, or how the dog is knuckling right now. And I think, as we're going along with this, I think we're going to find more and more opportunities to be even better at this. I mean, as you just said, for most of us, it's been less than 2 months. We're just figuring out how to walk. And this will be really exciting to see what this evolves with.
Yeah, and I think the other kind of side of that too is that I can tell you, like, and I'm sure we're not the only ones, like, now that this flow of those drop-off appointments is becoming a little bit more pronounced as kind of the standard of care moving forward, like, there's things that we're working on that are basically purpose-built to, like, completely help and support that flow. And so what's interesting is that, as clinics start to have these different workflows and experience pain points, there's a lot of people out there that are developing, solutions to help solve those. And so I think that, practices can piece together a lot of tools themselves with their kind of own staff acting, as glue, so to speak. But, the ability, for example, you're talking about that kind of concierge piece, like the ability to have a really good intake process when you're booking those exams completely changes what those telemedicine consults can look like. Yeah. The ability to send the proper email confirmation so that people are testing using the system so that you don't waste the first 10 minutes on technical difficulties. It's one of the reasons for our service that we ended up integrating with Zoom, because it should be as simple as possible for people to log onto those calls. And if they have to like create accounts, download special software, use a weird interface that they're not used to, it's just naturally going to lead to the likelihood of something going wrong. And so again, I think with the tools that are available today, the practices can kind of combine them with the help of partners like us and their own staff to really create an experience that is really powerful and really positive for their clients without necessarily having to reinvent the wheel or even create new technologies, just by using off-the-shelf pieces. One of the things that I think will come out through this, in addition to that medical record piece, is like the booking process. Most practices have not offered online booking in a really meaningful way for the last, ever. And so now with telemedicine consults and things like that, like that bi-directional booking, the ability for clients to say, I want to book a slot now, or I want to drop my pet off at that. We know that those are capabilities that clients have wanted, but for whatever reasons, practices haven't adopted those. And now they're being forced to in order to support those workflows. But as a result now, practices have online booking. That's just kind of a byproduct of what's happened. And that's something that, has historically taken months, if ever, for practices to really meaningfully implement.
So I've got a couple more questions with the time that we have left. And the one is, we've talked a lot about technology. And there will probably be practices watching this that are small, 1 or 2 doctor practices. Can a practice be too small to adopt this technology? Is this technology expensive? Is there a barrier to entry?
I'm not going to say like no across the board, because I'm sure some technology companies and their solutions, cost money that might not be affordable for practices. It's one of the reasons, we went with a different business model so that there wasn't any cost to getting going. And it was basically a product of how well you work with the tools. But I will say this, one of the advantages, and a better way for small practices to think about this, is that oftentimes you actually have a lot of advantages right now as opposed to larger practices. You can move a heck of a lot quicker. You are much more in tune with your clients' needs. And so I think that there's an opportunity and trust there that's been built up to really go out of your way. Not to pigeonhole anybody, but I can imagine like a local practice here that's been in the community for 10 or 15 years, that everybody knows the owner, is probably in a better position right now to leverage some of that goodwill from their client base than other types of practice relationships. And then I think the other thing too is that, and this is across the entire software world, small teams now, because of the tools that are available, can have superpowers. Like they can, with technologies like ours, like your front desk never has to close. People can talk to a vet whenever they want. They can order medications and prescribe, like things that would normally take teams of people, or maybe large hospital administrations and organizations to be able to pull off. Your practice can now adopt. And it's less of like, do the tools exist, and how do you pull them together in a way that makes the experience work for your clients and makes it work for your staff. But honestly, and this might be, I'd rather be a small practice right now because the decision making is much, it's much more in your hands, and you can respond much more quickly.
More nimble.
Yeah, exactly.
My last question is, and this is sort of like, and it's almost an impossible question to answer, but no matter how you answer it, you won't be wrong. And that is, with these technological changes, whether it's telemedicine, e-commerce, what do you think the average companion animal vet practice is going to look like in 2 or 3 years?
I'm going to say I don't know, because I think it's probably the right answer. But I think that there'll be a couple of trends that might converge in interesting ways, and certainly some things that we're looking at. So I do think that there will be, I think virtual services will continue. I think there'll be practices where that's much more integrated in. I think you'll actually start to see practices that are kind of built from scratch to be like pet only clinics, where right now we're in one of the challenges right now, putting aside the technologies, that the physical footprint of clinics was fundamentally built for a radically different experience, where the practice is laid out, the way that the space is used, and in a world in which maybe going into the practice is kind of the last thing that you do. those spaces can look and function radically different. So I think I wouldn't be surprised if there's a company that says like, we are going to open a chain of practices that are really focused on that drop-off model, because I think it will be something that, in addition to being common in some respects, like we already did drop-offs with dentals. There's a lot of advantages to the drop-off model that I think could really be maximized when there's that kind of connection with the space, right?
And boy, will the overhead be low.
Yeah, it will look radically different. Like, think about like Apple's store, right? If you can buy an iPhone online that ships to your house in a day, like why would you have a store for that? And the reality is, like, they're not going in to sell you stuff, they're going to sell you an experience. And so a lot of the biggest retailers have already recognized that because of e-commerce, we can't just have a transaction occur at these physical stores. We need to deepen the relationship with the brand and help people actually have that experience. And so as a result, I think practices will begin to perhaps look a little bit differently. The second thing too is that I think that there's going to be, supporting that model, a lot of unique kind of payment and other ways to help people actually afford care. My take on this is like, we'll probably be entering a recessionary market. In the past, the veterinary profession has responded quite well in those markets because people still want to care for their pets, but it's different if they can't physically bring their pets in. Right. And even if that is the case, I think people are going to want different financial options, and that's going to be putting pressure on the practices to have those available. Insurance is one, payment plans is another, wellness plans, loyalty programs, things where you can provide people with flexible options to ensure that their pets can get care and be in the business of helping them help their pets and make the care more attainable, I think will work out well for practices. So I'm not exactly sure how that will all look. The other thing that I'm really interested in is like the role of locums and relief veterinarians in this environment, because I think that there is a really powerful relationship that can be formed where these are veterinarians, and we work quite closely with a number of them that have seen their shifts go to like zero. Right. So these are people that have been really hard hit. Some of them are the last people whose shifts will be brought back, yet they have relationships with practices, they have relationships with clients, and can they be a resource that, perhaps they become the channel through which virtual care is brought to some of these practices. And there's some things that we're doing now to explore that. So I don't know where that will all kind of end up, but I do think there's still recipes in there for practices to be very successful.
Yeah. So I think overall the thing, is to the change is happening to us, whether we want to be part of the change or not. We got to get on board. I got one last question here. I want to make sure I cut the questions there. And then this person asked, so much is being paid by credit card, curbside, and telemed, and I'd like to find a way to avoid all the credit card fees. Any suggestions? No kidding. Boy, I just was going through my own budget, looking at the credit card fees, and yikes, yeah.
Yeah, so I think we can kind of maybe like separate out kind of a couple pieces here. There's the idea of if you have one visit and you're having to have like 4 different charges, like putting aside the fees, like that's a bad experience for clients. Like it would be nice to just charge them once. The reality is that as far as I can see right now, like the ability to eliminate like credit card processing fees is pretty, like, it's not really, so like anything that you buy online, there's always those fees associated with it. Like it's going to be, you're going to have to pay. Exactly. Right. And so you might be sitting there and be like, well, I'm going to do e-transfers for all this because it's going to save me money. But in the long run, it actually doesn't. No. Because the amount of effort, the security implications, the lack of integration, all of that is just more time, energy, and effort that you have to expend. And so the goal, I don't think, is to eliminate those fees, but maybe create an experience where it's only one, it's connected. People don't feel like they're being dinged 8 different times. And you can help understand why you're having to pay those fees in the first place. But this is where, for example, in our telemedicine model, like we bake in the payment processing fees to our business model, because like adding another 3% on top of what the clinics are expecting, like that, I just don't think that's very transparent. And that's not the way that we want to do business as a company. So I think that's important when you look at these options to understand like what is the bottom line of what is going to happen as a result of these services, because oftentimes companies might just forget or not bring attention to the fact, oh yeah, like that payment processing fee, like, oh, we're going to charge you that as well, right? And so it's better to ask those questions up front.
Sure. Adam, we're almost near the end of our time. I just want to make sure, have we covered everything that we need to cover? Is there any last words of thoughts or advice that you might want to share with anybody?
No, I think the thing that has kind of kept us sane in this is that it's been really helpful for our team not to react to what's happening, but instead of work towards something. Like working towards an experience that we want to create, that we can get excited about, that we think can help people. And I think, especially given the high amounts of burnout, if you frame this less of a, we're implementing this new technology and solution, but rather like, what is the experience? Like if you were a client of our practice right now, what is the experience that you would want? And what can we do together to create that experience? Because it's going to take that energy and put it into something constructive where people want to see these problems fixed. They want a solution that's going to work for them, as opposed to just feeling like they're just overwhelmed with what the world's throwing at them. Like that sense of purpose right now for practices, I think is really important to reignite and really reinforce this idea that the work that you're doing for your teams is important. Right? There's a lot of businesses that are closed. There's a lot of people that are struggling. There's a lot of pets that are going to need care. Like what veterinary clinics are doing right now is really important stuff. Yeah. And the challenges might look different in 6 months, but they're not just going to go away overnight. And so it's important to build a model and experience that is not just serving your clients, but is really born out of the suggestions and excitement and passion of your team, because they're going to be the ones that are necessary to propel it forward.
Well, I think those were great last words to end on. I'd like to thank you very much for taking the time. I wish you luck. I'm sure we'll be speaking to you again as we go along with this COVID-19. It's as our economies and societies are opening up. We're still very early into this, and there's so many unknowns. So I love when you say, when I ask, what will the practice of the future look like? I don't know, and I think that we're all that way. It drives me crazy when I read things, but well, that's what the future of travel, the future of business is like. We have no idea. I mean, it just is all so brand new. Thank you very much, Adam.
Yeah. No worries. Take care, everybody. Stay safe and stay sane.
All right. Thank you all. Bye-bye.